Our speaker this afternoon is Professor Glen McHale. I'm sure most of you would have met him before. He joined recently, Edinburgh, end of July, precisely. So he's relatively new to the University of Edinburgh, but he has been on the scene in the UK for quite a long time. Prior to joining the University of Edinburgh, Glen was Pro Vice Chancellor at Northumbria University in Newcastle. The research of Glen focuses on both understanding and then manipulating how liquids interact with surfaces at different scales. So the first step is to understand how it happens, and the following step, which is obvious, is to use it for some engineering application. And that's exactly what Glen is going to talk about today. Glen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Khalil, and thank you, Rohan. So I'll just share my screen, and hopefully when I do that, I will be able to pull up. Can I just double check that you can see the talk, Khalil? Khalil, can you speak to me? You can
yeah,
see that.
I can see your first slide, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, can I say welcome to everybody? I'm delighted to be here in the digital space, obviously afternoon in the UK and obviously a very different time at other parts of the world, but very pleased to see you all. Today I'll take you through a little bit of the recent work we've done on smart slippery surfaces, very much funded by the UK Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and with large amounts of contribution from colleagues, Rodrigo, Gary, Stephen, Elfiger and others, both here and at other universities. So I guess I'll just say very briefly who we are. My name, Glen McHale. I'm very interested, as Khalil says, about the solid-liquid interface. I guess that's where I live, so to speak. I deal with droplets on surfaces, the wetting of those surfaces. I look at how surfaces can be structured and changed sometimes, often using nature-inspired biomimetic principles. And then I move over into things like drag reduction, droplet evaporation. I use electrical field principles, and occasionally I use some sensor principles. Within the wider group that I work with, Gary is a very excellent experimentalist, materials and microsystems, but also has lots of knowledge I don't have around things like liquid optics, liquid crystals, elastomers. Rodrigo, within the wider group, does theory and modeling, all of the things on the above, but also lattice Boltzmann methods, elastocapillary, low Reynolds numbers flow, microsonars, etc. And we currently here in Edinburgh have two postdocs, Elfiger working on the theory side, Stephen working on experimental side, and we have a new EPSRC project starting, so there'll be a third postdoc joining in March. We also have a few PhD students, Hernan and Michele, who's just joined us. We'll have one joining us soon and a further one joining Rodrigo. So that's the sort of core group here at Edinburgh as a whole. And we do a whole range of work. These are some examples of the types of work we do as a whole. So I guess for this seminar, what are the key research questions that I'm currently thinking about and trying to answer? And I realized when I wrote these, they're all how-to questions, although the why is also in there. So how can we make surfaces slippery to liquids? How do we do that? What are the different approaches? And when we do put liquid droplets on those surfaces, how do they interact? And how do they move on these types of surfaces? And can we control and change the interactions? And those are the sort of questions I'm currently interested in. And I guess the approach I would say is always around conceive, design, build and test. We think about how the world might behave and how it might be different. We try to design how to look at that in the laboratory. We build collaborations, we build experiments, we build the theory, so to speak, that go with all of that, and then we test. And we often use these nature and bioinspired principles, which tend to combine surface texture, surface chemistry, and surface lubrication. We often pattern surfaces, whether that's through lithography or other techniques, to create gradients in how droplets sit on surfaces and liquids sit on surfaces, their wettability. And we look at dielectric properties of liquids to control the wettability. So surfaces have interactions that can be tuned and can be changed in real time. I guess the punch of a button or the rotation of a dial. And those are some of the techniques that currently we use. Let me give you, I guess, 2 example surfaces which are sort of natural. And I'll just show you the first one of those surfaces. And that's a Nepenthes Pitcher Plant. This idea came from Joanna Eisenberg at Harvard, not our idea. And this is a dry surface plant. It's a cup-like plant, and the ants can walk all over the inside with no risk of sliding or falling in to the inside of the plant, where there's a digestive chamber where they would lose their lives. However, when it is wet, you get a very different situation whereby the ants, no matter how much they try to hold to the surface, find they lose their adhesion and they will slide into these digestive juices in the plant. And the reason for that is the plants retain a film of water on the surface when they're wet. And the oils on the feet of insect can no longer adhere to the surface. And so oil and water, so to speak, don't mix. And so you get a sliding effect. And that idea of using a surface texture to hold a lubricant is a very powerful one that we mimic and copy. And so the surface here becomes slippery when wet. So you have a surface-bound lubricant. I guess one of my favorite clips I've seen in movies, I've shown this at some seminars, is probably this one.
We can't hear the sound, Glenn.
All right. I don't know why that is clear. Hopefully there's not too much sound.
That's okay. I remember a script of ants.
We'll do it in silence. I don't know what the clip is. I can hear the sound fine. So I don't like. It's probably not the same without sound, but there's some fantastic things in this particular clip from the movies. And one of the things you see there, you see all sorts of things when you look at this very carefully. You see that there's a water drop that completely balls up on the leaf, on the surface of a leaf. And actually that's unusual, because if you think of a hydrophobic or water repellent surface like Teflon, you would normally only get just over half of a sphere. You'd never get a balled up droplet. And so something's going on about the surface of the plant. And then of course you see someone pushing a stick against, or an ant pushing a stick against the ball of liquid. You see an ant trapped on the inside. And so you see something about the forces that are going on. And probably also the video here will not have sound. Can I just check, Khalil? Can you hear anything?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear the video?
No, we can't hear the videos.
So here what you're seeing is a real video of an ant whereby the water droplet is encompassing the ant. And as it tries to break free, you see the surface between the water and the vapor. The ant can't break through, and no matter how much it tries to fight its way out, it uses the mechanical strength, it can't break free of that droplet. And so what it tells you is that capillary forces dominate at very small length scales. And that's a really powerful understanding. You can sort of understand it because when you look at the force of gravity is mass times the acceleration due to gravity, and mass is density times volume. A volume is a cube, length, breadth, height, or cube of the radius of a sphere. But it's the blue curve on this graph. Surface tension is a force per unit length, and that's linear, and that's the other color on here. And so as you go very small, the thing that matters most is the surface tension, not the gravity. And so when you look at the scaling laws, you have a crossover. And small here means 2.73 millimeters. And so what it means is anything that's around 0.273 millimeters or smaller is dominated by surface tension. And that's why something like the ant gets trapped at the interface of a water drop. And you'll see other types of interfacial tensions, not just the surface from water to vapor, but a surface from water to solid, from the solid to vapor, And those three interfacial tensions determine the shape of things like droplets on a fence. And what we can do is take a substrate and we can make a sort of bed of nails effect where you have hydrophobic spikes, and water will not be able to penetrate down between the spikes, and therefore it will sit very much on the tips. And that means it will ball up. And that's the kind of effect you saw in the plant. Some of my early work was very much in looking at those things, such as pillared surfaces made with lithography or etched surfaces. The one on the right retains a sort of fond memory of this, because this was an undergraduate student project on the right, where they etched a copper surface. They showed me the picture on the bottom right of a perfectly balled up droplet. And it took a postdoc about 4 to 6 months to reproduce that. And what I didn't know at the time was the undergrad went outside to have a smoke, and they used to over etch their surface. So it wasn't the surface shown in the picture there. The craters, this is top view of copper, etch until they joined, leaving pinnacles just in between. And when that surface is made hydrophobic, you got a completely balled up droplet of water. The image from the side with the reflection. And so that capillary forces dominating is very powerful. So what you find is there are different interfacial strategies to create surfaces on which liquids can move. If we start just with a smooth surface where we have a droplet, there are 3 interfacial tensions: the solid to the vapor, the liquid to the vapor, the solid to liquid. Think of those as forces. And essentially they determine what's called the contact angle. And that, I would say, was the chemistry. You can, of course, reduce the amount of contact between the liquid and the solid by using something like this bed of nails effect. And that's one interfacial strategy. You replace the contact area from the liquid to the solid by much less solid to liquid and some liquid to vapor. You can also essentially tear up all of those nails and decorate your water in the nails. And so the water decorates itself and forms a soft object. And what you've essentially got then is the object moving across the solid surface and a solid to solid contact. So it's a different interfacial strategy. You can also essentially remove all of the solid together and leave just a vapor layer below your droplet, and that's the Leidenfrost effect. So if you have a plate that's held at a couple of hundred Celsius, you put a water drop against it, you have an instantaneous vaporization of the liquid at the interface, and the droplet is then levitated on the vapor and completely balls up. Very, very low friction on that surface for water. You can also take the first one, the superhydrophobic one, and replace all the air, which is one fluid, by a liquid, a lubricant liquid, an oil, for example. And you can make a combined solid lubricant interface on which your droplet sits. Sometimes the lubricant will spread over the droplet, and so you can have an encapsulated or cloaked droplet as a whole. And sometimes the lubricant can be so good that it coats even the tops of your nails. That's the green here. And so your droplet sits on entirely a film of oil and is really slippy. And again, the lubricant can cloak over the top of the droplet. Another strategy is you can take a lubricant but essentially attach it covalently to the solid, and then your droplet sits on some very free end chains, some PDMS chains, which behave as if they were liquid. And so there are probably at least something like 5 strategies, and you could say there are something like 6 interfacial strategies you can adopt to try to make very lubricated interfaces. If you go back in my work a few years ago, I was very interested in the superhydrophobicity, and one of the things we did with people in Southampton was to look at drag reduction, so one of the applications. And here's a lab. We took some big tubes, that's on the left, and we filled them with water. On the bottom is just a container we bought from the DIY shop, so that if we had a leak, we didn't flood the lab too much. First tube wasn't transparent, second tube was a transparent tube. We put some light gates in, and what we did was create some spheres, some plastic spheres about 2 centimeters in diameter. We placed hydrophobic sand on those spheres, and that hydrophobic layer of sand creates a superhydrophobic surface, a bed of nails effect. But now what you can do is you can put that sphere into water and allow the sphere to just settle in the water and measure the terminal velocity. And what this video is I'm going to show is really the average video of 10 for 3 different situations. One is where the sphere is just falling at bottom at terminal velocity. The middle one is where the sphere has got a layer of air held by that superhydrophobicity. And the third one is that superhydrophobic sphere, where we use a trick from biology of essentially replacing the air by water, so it's carrying the water with it. We just allow the objects to fall and measure their terminal velocity. And what you can see is that the terminal velocity of the sphere falling in the center is larger than the sphere on either side. And these are 3 aligned videos. And so I guess it could be seen as surprising that a sphere falling whilst it carries a layer of air that gives more buoyancy can fall faster. So it has less drag, and that overcomes the extra buoyancy. When you look at that video, the sphere doesn't fall straight, and that's a clue as to what's happening here. And this is in a Reynolds number regime somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000. We also did experiments doing soot, superhydrophobic carbon nanoparticles wrapped into a layer of PDMS that was then wrapped around a brass cylinder. We put that into a recirculating water chamber and used a laser Doppler system to measure the velocity field in the wake. And if you do that, you can work out the drag coefficient as a function of the Reynolds number. And what this is showing is what you've got with a smooth plane cylinder, a cylinder with a carbon nanoparticles, a superhydrophobic one, but which has been wetted out, so there is no layer of air. And then what we've got at the bottom is one where we have a layer of air trapped by those carbon nanoparticles. You have a reduction in drag of about 15%, sorry, 30% in this one. And so the idea of keeping a layer of air around an object allows you to lubricate motion, both internal motion of a liquid through, say, a pipe, or external motion, for example, a ship moving through the ocean, for example, you would do. And people are looking at that today to see whether you can get long-term resilient methods of doing that rather than just a transient effect as a whole. Now you can sort of understand some of this because you can build an analytical model at very low Reynolds number where you think of a compound object with a sphere that's a solid surrounded by a complete layer of air with a flow past it. You can solve that analytically at low Reynolds number, and you find the drag reduction goes down as you increase the thickness of the air layer. But as you make the air layer even thicker, the drag goes up again. And that's because the initial effect as you put an air layer around is to create a lubrication of the motion of the external fluid around the solid. But if you keep making it larger, then essentially the solid gets larger because it's the solid plus the air layer, and you have much more of a blockage. And so there are 2 competing effects. With the people at Southampton, they did computational fluid dynamics, and they went up to Reynolds numbers of 100. And as you go up to the higher Reynolds numbers, the drag reduction becomes quite dramatic. And the reason for that one is to do with the wake. So this figure here is showing a sphere. In the top is the flow from left to right of water past the sphere, and it shows how you have a flow separation, a vortex attached to the back of the sphere. The bottom half is showing what happens if you can keep a layer of air next to the sphere, in which case you suppress the vortex. And since most of the drag is created by the wake and the vortex, then in fact you can reduce the drag significantly. If you start to think of sort of pockets of air recirculating, then you get some drag reduction, but not as much. Okay. You can actually think in terms of boundary conditions for flow. And for example, in these cases, in your air layer, there's nowhere for the air to go other than to recirculate. And so you have an assumption, a boundary condition of a recirculating air layer. And you can convert that into slip boundary conditions. So rather than having a layer of fluid at the surface of the solid flowing from left to right, creating a slip effect, an apparent slip, which is related to the ratio of the viscosity of the bulk fluid to the surface layer of fluid, you can get some backflow, some recirculation, and that gives you a smaller slip length, and you essentially get this kind of picture. And so you can start to come up with general boundary conditions for slip in this kind of case. But it does involve, therefore, a recirculating layer of gas or vapor. What we've been interested in much more recently is conformal lubricant surfaces. So very thin layers of lubricant on a surface in order to lubricate the flow of something or the motion of something past it. So instead of using a layer of air as a lubricant, we now start to think in terms of oils. So we don't need to ball up a droplet in order to move it on surface. In fact, if you think of a surface, if you can make a surface such that a very small tilt, when the droplet starts to lean down the slope, that you can remove pinning, then in fact the droplet will move very quickly. And one of the ways of doing this is this pitcher plant effect. So there you take a porous surface, for example, you make sure it's hydrophobic so that water doesn't want to be next to the solid. You infuse an oil into that hydrophobic surface, and then your test liquid, water droplet in this case, will sit on the oil but won't displace the oil, and so it will never come into contact with the solid. And that's really effective. So what this is a layer of glass. It's a glass microscope slide. It's had a nanoparticle, hydrophobic nanoparticle, superhydrophobic layer put down, and that oil is being infused into it, and then a water droplet is on the top. And as you move the glass slide around, the droplet moves very freely. And we make that kind of surface both from spraying down superhydrophobic coatings and from lithographic methods. And if you do that, in this case at the bottom, another surface we made with lithography, you only need a tilt away from the horizontal of less than 1 degree for the droplet to slide down there. You can see the droplet, where it comes into contact with the surface, has a sort of, you might call it a skirt. It's got a flaring, and that's the oil being drawn up onto the droplet itself. And we've done experiments around evaporation. So you can see the skirt there is very apparent. This is a droplet of water evaporating. And as it evaporates very smoothly until it vanishes, keeping an apparent contact angle, which is constant until the last part of the evaporation. You can measure contact area with time for that kind of evaporation, and you find a completely linear behavior. So you have a steady change of the contact area with time as you have evaporation happening, and that's a perfect example of constant contact angle evaporation. And that's a slippery surface because the contact line pinning is reduced because you've converted the solid liquid interaction, that interface you've replaced by a liquid lubricant interface and interaction. Another interesting thing is you can come up with an analogue of Young's law. Young's law is this law about the contact angle for a droplet on a solid surface. And you can work out the angle from the interfacial tensions. And what I guess we came up with a few years ago was the idea of a liquid form of Young's law. So you can think in terms of having an infinitely deep bath of oil, and you put a droplet of water on that bath, and you end up with a liquid lens with 3 interfacial tensions, the gammas pointing at the edge. But you can imagine a thought experiment where the bath is not infinitely deep, but you start to bring up the base of the bath, and you have a very thin liquid film, thin lubricant film. And as you do that, a pressure forms on the droplet from below, and you distort the lens to start to look like a droplet. And I guess philosophically, if you were to move the substrate all the way to the top, and you would break through the lubricant layer, the green, the thin liquid film, you go to a droplet on a surface with Young's law. And so there must be a transition from one to the other situation as you do that thought experiment. And so if you think about the very side of the droplet, you can think of the forces acting just at where the droplet touches the lubricant film. These are the gammas. And those 3 forces, in a way, you can think of almost being at the point where they meet. And if so, you can think of resolving the forces to ask, how does the motion of the edge change? And if you have a layer of the lubricant wrapping over the drop, then what you have is an effective surface tension as you go from the droplet to the oil, that's the green, and as you go from the oil to the vapor. And so you can think of that effective surface tension depending whether the lubricant spreads on the droplet or not. That's why it's an effective one, depends on the spreading power. And you can resolve the forces at the contact lining to the horizontal. You rearrange that, you can find an apparent contact angle. So the angle at the edge will be the difference between the interfacial tension between the oil and the vapor, the oil in the droplet divided by an effective surface tension, which is to do with the droplet to the vapor. And that's an interesting law because it looks like Young's law, but none of those surface tensions involves the solid. And so it truly is a liquid form of Young's law. And so droplets on what we call conformal lubricant surfaces obey a liquid analogue of Young's law. Conformal here simply means the lubricant is thin and is retained by the solid surface, no matter what shape it adopts. You can do other things. You can then start to think of a composite surface where you have a solid surface, maybe as a bed of nails, the orange, where you fill the gaps between with the oil, that's the green, and actually a droplet sees the peaks of the solid, the peaks of the nails, and then the lubricant in between. It sits on a composite solid oil surface. And you can think of interfacial tensions as being composites of the solid surface fraction and the oil surface fraction. You can work out what it looks like with a film of oil wrapping the droplet. You can think of the effective surface tension. You can resolve forces on this composite surface, and you can find an apparent contact angle that turns out to be a very simple combination of the contact angle you'd have for the droplet on the solid plus the contact angle for the droplet on the liquid in terms of a weighted average of the surface fractions, Fs, solid fraction, and 1 minus Fs, the lubricant fraction of the surface. And that's known as Cassie's law, but it's now a lubricant version of Cassie's law. It has two limits. One gives you the solid Young's law, the one we're familiar with. The other gives you this sort of lubricant or liquid Young's law. And so you can think of droplets on composite solid lubricant surfaces with apparent contact angles starting to do the same as a droplet would do on a composite solid surface. And you can play with that. So one of the things you always know is gradients in wettability. If you have a surface where a droplet is more balled up in one area and less balled up in another, in other words, it's more repellent in one area and less repellent in the other area for the droplet will try to move if it can where there is a greater wetting, where it's much more like a film. And so we can do that here. And in this particular experiment, the first figure is a droplet on a lubricant surface. So it's a nanoparticle surface, hydrophobic, that's been impregnated with lubricant. And the droplet sits there looking sideways. We have an angle at the edge of about 108 degrees. We can accurately predict that. We can now create a set of rails. This is work Gary led with Gabby, who's the postdoc. And we can make sure those nanoparticles follow the shape of the surface. And then we can put the lubricant between the nanoparticles. So we essentially create a lubricant surface that's now got a macroscopic structure. When you do that, when you put the droplet down, if these length scales are about right, the droplet won't penetrate between the surface features, but will sit just on the tips of them. But it will always be in contact just with the lubricant. And as a consequence, you've got a sort of liquid form of a superhydrophobic surface, and you can do some measurements to show it behaves as you'd expect to get. So a liquid on liquid Cassie-Baxter equation can be used without any contact to the solid. What can we do? You can also take those rails, and what you can do is make them wider at one end and narrow at another end, so that as the droplet sits on the rails, if it moves to one end, it'll be mainly on lubricant. If it moves to the other end, it'll be mainly on the solid coated in lubricant. Sorry, mainly on, I should say, the space between the rails at one end. And so what you can do is you can get droplets that will now try to move themselves from one end to the other. So this is a side view. These are these lubricated rails, and a droplet of water is down, and it naturally moves itself from one end to the other. And it will move itself over centimeters, so it will do what we would call longer distance transport. Here's an example where that surface is tilted and the droplet will drive itself uphill as it seeks out the area of lower wettability. You can curve them, so you can make a surface, you can make the rails so they form a circle, so to speak. This is a top view, and the droplet will then follow the rails wherever the rails go, in this case round in an arc, and drive itself around that arc. You can, of course, flip your surface upside down and then throw droplets upwards. In this case, they're, I think, propelled upwards using a microphone speaker, sorry, a loudspeaker, and the droplets will attach to the surface. Because whilst this surface is slippery going from left to right, if you try to pull a droplet off, you can't do that. If you think about having two planes of glass, and you have two plates of glass, you put a little layer of liquid between them, something like water, and you put the two glass panes together, you find it very hard to pull them apart but you can slide them apart. And so it's possible to have strong adhesion normal to the surface whilst having very easy transport along the surface. And so you get some special properties there. Okay. You can also make droplets move in either direction. So one of the things that normally happens when people deal with gradient wettability surfaces is you usually only get one direction of travel. So for instance, if we make a superhydrophobic surface, a bed of nails, where the nails will get closer together in one area, the further apart to begin with, the droplet will move across the surface to the area where those nails are closer together because it's trying to get to the area which is more wettable. If we now replace the air by a lubricant, we can choose lubricants that are more or less wetting than the solid. And if that's the case, then in fact we can work out from the combination that in fact you'll get a force imbalance for the droplet that will be driven by the difference in the cosines of the Young's angle on the solid or the lubricant, and that sign can be either direction. It can be a plus or a minus. And so we've done experiments as well as simulations where we make a sort of pillared surface, but in between the pillars there's lubricant, and then we have a denser solid, a denser area of pillars and a less dense area. And according to the lubricant we have between the pillars, the droplet will either move from right to left or left to right. In this case, in one case we have an iron liquid, in the other case we have something called Krytox as the lubricant within the surface, and the droplet will self-propel from one side to the other. And so we can make bidirectional motion. Lots of other things you can do. One thing we've done with Khalil, we've got a project from EPSRC, Khalil, is look at these Leidenfrost surfaces. So this is where you have a surface at maybe 200 Celsius or higher. You have a droplet touches the surface, you get an instant vaporization of a layer of the water at that surface. That means there's very poor thermal transport through the vapor layer, so the droplet doesn't evaporate so fast, doesn't boil away fast. And as a consequence, it just sits on the vapor layer and can slide around. So you go from a sort of frying pan effect to this kind of levitation effect for your droplet. And you get what we might call perfect hydrophobicity. And one of the ideas that Khalil came up to is summarized in this video, which tries to show a whole set of work, hopefully without sound. And so you see that this is now a super hot surface. It's on the right hand side of that graph I showed. It's a droplet sat on a super hot surface. What you then do is you create a ratchet surface. So the vapor starts to come out in a directed form. It starts to flow in a particular form. And that causes shear stress on the bottom of the droplet that drags the droplet in a particular direction. Here the droplets, we're looking down on the droplet. It's now being forced to go around in an orbit. If we put a metal plate on top of the droplet, then you actually transfer the rotational motion into a spinning effect. Of course, you don't need to do it just by water. You can use something like dry ice and sublimation, and you can get a self-propelled motion from the vapor underneath as this speeds up. And I guess if you want to look at this, you could start to do things like build motors and extract a little bit of power from it and start to create an engine. Not a very efficient engine, but it's essentially you have a very low friction bearing, but you also have a vapor flowing which generates drive. And as a consequence, you get both a heat engine and a physical mechanical engine. Another thing we've done, this was Stephen's PhD, is starting to look at these solid sort of tethered lubricants. So they are essentially omniphobic, completely phobic to everything, covalent and attached to the solid surface, liquid light surfaces. And they're essentially a hydrophobic polydimethyl siloxane system. And we go through something that the chemists have come up with, and we make some chains which are about 4 nanometers long. They're packed, they're tethered at the bottom end where the solid is, but the top ends are very free, they're very mobile. And when you put a droplet on this surface, it moves very easily. You can see how easily this is a droplet of water evaporating on one of these surfaces. It's evaporating very smoothly. There's absolutely no pinning, and the droplet will go away, maintaining until the very end a constant contact angle. And where you can measure the contact area as a function of time, you can look at the relative humidity effect, and you can verify that follows all of the laws you'd expect to follow. It's interesting though, in that experiment, as you change the relative humidity, then you do get a step change. The contact angle here on the surface normally is about 105 degrees if you're about 60, 70% relative humidity. But if you go to a very dry atmosphere, it drops to about 101, 102 degrees, and it's almost a step function. We're not really sure why that happens, but we'd like to understand that better. So this surface is slippery due to a liquid-like flexibility of non-cross-linked polydimethyl chains. And it's a robust surface, it's transparent, it's thin, and it's relatively simple to make. Another area we've looked at is using these electric fields in order to manipulate what happens with liquids on surfaces. So if I think of a liquid on a surface, a solid, I could take a liquid that's something like a transformer oil, so it has a dielectric property, so it has dipoles in which will align if I put an electric field on. And if I then generate an electric field that is pointing vertically away from the solid, so the voltage is exponentially decaying as you come away from the liquid, this would be in air, then you can polarize the dipoles in a surface layer of the liquid next to the solid surface. Okay. What that means is you have the capillary forces, the interfacial tensions and the interfacial energy, but you also now have some stored capacitive energy from the polarization of the dipoles. And what that allows you to do is alter the angle at the edge of the droplet. So it allows you to apply a voltage which alters how much the surface will wet. So in this case, the cosine of the angle you measure depends upon what you'd have with no voltage, plus some parameters which are permittivities. There's something to do with the length scale, something to do with the interfacial tension, but there's a voltage squared in there because it's a capacitive effect. And so by altering the voltage, you can alter the angle. And so you can come up with the relationship between the angle you expect, the wetting you expect, and the voltage. And there's a particular voltage at which you will cause the droplet to form into a complete film on the surface, even if the surface wouldn't normally want a liquid to form into a film. So the way we would do that is we would lithographically fabricate some electrodes which are playing parallel on the top of something like a glass slide. We'd take a signal generator with a voltage that would be operating at a few kilohertz, maybe 10 kilohertz. We'd apply that to the interdigitated array, and that would create an electric field that would decay coming away from the surface, and it would drag the droplet out into a sort of sausage looking from the top, rather than being just a top. So here we see from top view, we've got a droplet. As we increase the voltage from 100 volts to 200 to 300 volts, it spreads along the electrodes. And as we take the voltage down the bottom, it comes back to being a droplet. If you look sideways, then reading down the diagram, you start with 0 volts, you see the cross section, its reflection, then you see the droplet spread out. Then when you get to the bottom of the diagram, you go to the right, you come back up again, and the droplet comes back from being a film to a droplet as you reduce the voltage. And so we can go all the way from having a droplet on a surface to having a film on a surface by adjusting the voltage, even if that surface is a phobic surface that doesn't want a liquid on it. Okay. On this graph, I've simply shown the angle at the edge that you would measure versus the voltage horizontally. And we can now essentially choose what type of wetting we want on the surface by choosing the voltage. What you can do, of course, is put a droplet down when you've got a particular voltage on the surface and watch the droplet evolve over time and measure the time sequence of what you see. And you can get a sort of droplet that evolves into a partially wetting droplet over a period of time. That's an exponential approach to equilibrium. You can get a droplet that would approach all the way down to a film, or you can apply a voltage which would give you beyond the film, which you might cause super spreading. You can drive faster spreading than you would normally get, and you can control that with an applied voltage. Here's a video just showing that. This is a sideways view, and I just switch on the voltage and see what happens with the droplet, and suddenly the droplet just spreads out. Take the voltage off, it comes back again. And we can look at all of the dynamics for those kinds of processes and show how those dynamics change as you alter your voltage as a whole. And so you can get super spreading, and you can look at relationships for how the geometry of the droplet changes with time. One of the things we've done is de-wetting. One thing that's very interesting for people, say in printing and many processes, is what happens when you want to create a film but the film starts to break up on the surface. And this is an example here. So in this case, we form a stripe. Left-hand side is a view of the stripe. There are 3 different videos here. The right-hand view is looking down on the top. And if I trigger the videos, you'll see what happens as we turn the voltage off. On the bottom one, you can see that it's still coming inwards. The droplet is the stripe, the film is still retracting on the surface to form a droplet. I'll show that again if I can. Here's the start, turn the voltage off, and you get a retraction of liquid from the surface. But what happens is at the very edge, you get a shaping of the edges before it forms a more circular cap profile droplet and comes together. And so you get 2 stages in this de-wetting from a surface. You get a sort of retreat of the edge, the rim, with a constant speed. And then you get a sort of point where the rims seem to meet each other. They seem to sense the presence of each other, and the whole droplet shapes itself such that the surface comes back to its equilibrium. And you can measure the speed as a function of various parameters, and you can look at the relaxation time for those things to happen. So it's quite a powerful tool. You can, if you're doing lithography, you don't have to make the overlap between electrodes equal. You don't have to have a linear stripe. You could shape the electrodes into a circular patch. So this is looking down from the top. We have an oil spread out into a circular patch. We turn the field off, and you see the retraction of the droplet into the center. Looking from the side, you see the rim form at each side. You have a dimple in the middle. You get this retraction towards the center. Eventually, the 2 rims seem to know about each other, and then a droplet forms. And you can model that, and you can study it. You can do it not just with a droplet in air, you can do that with a droplet in another liquid, and you can study what happens when you have a liquid in liquid system. And so we can shape surfaces for wetting, we can shape areas, and we can programmably change how they wet by how we fabricate things. You, of course, if you're having a droplet spread into a film and your outer medium is another liquid, and you increase the viscosity of that outer liquid, then it's no surprise that the retraction from a film to a droplet takes longer. And so what we've got here is 3 videos showing at the top an external liquid that's low viscosity, in the middle is an external liquid of a medium viscosity, and at the bottom is a liquid with a higher viscosity. And what you see then is as the film of an oil starts to retract in there, then the higher viscosity in the outside slows down the retraction, and there's no great surprise to that. But there is a surprising effect for the substrate. So when you stretch a film out, a droplet out into a film on a substrate, what you're doing is storing energy by stretching the surfaces. And so you've got more stored energy. So as soon as you turn your voltage off and allow the film to come back to a droplet, you release that energy. And so you might imagine that the more energy you store, the faster the film would spring back to a droplet. It's like a spring effect. And that's true in the case of a very low viscosity outer liquid. It isn't actually true when you make the outer liquid more viscous. And so you actually find that a droplet recoils from the surface more slowly on a more philic surface, and more rapidly on a philic surface, and it recoils from the surface more slowly on a. So I got my language mixed up. Forgive me for that. But what I'm showing here is a film of an oil on a Teflon surface, recoiling from the Teflon surface, and it's recoiling at the top one there more slowly than it does from the bottom surface. So on the philic surface, it's recoiled quicker. The bottom one is quicker, the top one is slower, and that's counter what you might normally expect. The droplets can be switched to de-wetting quicker on a philic surface compared to a phobic one. I won't go through that. You can compare that to what you expect from Cox-Voinov theory, that's fluid mechanics, and you can sort of understand why. For very low outer viscosity liquids, the thing that dominates the timescale is the retraction of the rim. When you go to higher viscosity ratios, what dominates the overall time is the final stage of the retraction to a droplet. And actually, the more phobic you are, the more the droplet is balled up, and the more the dissipation for the process is in the outer liquid in what's now become a very confined space. And so you can compare to Cox-Voinov theory and conform Cox-Voinov theory. And this work was done over 5 orders in magnitude of viscosity ratio. Okay, I'm not going to go too much into this. I'm just going to quickly show you that that idea of making shapes is very flexible. You can make, this is looking down, you can make a liquid on a surface into a semicircular shape and study that. You can study it coming back to a different type of droplet. You can make squares and study how those de-wet. You can look at them de-wetting in different ways. You can make sort of semicircular shapes and look at how they de-wet and the process behind that. All of these are liquids coming to a single patch. So what you can do is create more complex topologies. So here we have a donut shape. The liquid is in the donut as a film. Then you allow it to retract from the surface and it forms a sort of donut ring, a torus on the surface. But what you also find is over time, that torus destabilizes and eventually it will break up into a number of droplets. And it keeps de-wetting. It's done the de-wetting phase. It's got an instability phase, and it gives you a number of modes. And actually, if you decrease volume or you change the phobicity of the substrate, you can start to determine how de-wetting happens and how many droplets you end up with, i.e., you can control the instability itself. So we can switch between partial wetting regimes and states, and we can control the instabilities, and we can understand those processes. So I'm coming to the end of the talk. I've talked through different types of surfaces from superhydrophobic through Leidenfrost to lubricant impregnated surfaces. And there are different strategies for making low friction surfaces for liquids. And you start to design very specific transport properties. I've tried to show that you can use voltages and electric fields to control liquids on surfaces and control instabilities. And I've shown something about the Leidenfrost effect. I won't say more on that as a whole. I'd like to thank Rohan, I'd like to thank Khalil for the invitation. I'd like to thank everyone who's really done the work at different universities and the funders. I guess I'd say thank you, and I'll just leave you with one video that Andy at Trent produced, which I think is a nice video in these times of coronavirus and all we face. Okay.
Thank you very much, Glenn. I don't know how to clap actually, but I would ask everybody actually to join me in thanking Glenn for this very, very good presentation. Yeah. Let me just say a few things before I floor for questions. Number one, I think this is a record in attendance. Since the start of these seminars in IMT, we had 47 people attending this seminar. We've never had this number, especially in person. The second thing is with such number of people, it will be a challenge to actually figure out who's going to ask the question. So I would ask anybody to raise their hand on Teams. I hope I can see hands. Sorry. Yeah, I don't know who's raising. If I notice your hand, please just go ahead and try to ask your question.
I think we have.
Not seeing the hands there.
Livio's got a hand raised.
Go ahead, Livio, if you have a question. We can't hear you.
And there's a question from Prash after Livio.
Prash? Yes, you're muted.
Yeah, Glenn, thanks a lot for the talk. I just was very interested about the Rayleigh plateau instability that you showed. So what governs the wave number? You mentioned that the volume is one of the key factors that can govern the wave number for the instability. How much influence does voltage have? I mean, am I correct in noting that that was induced by?
Yeah, there's several things, Prash, because the way we've done that, of course, is we predetermine the ring on which we're going to put the liquid down, because that's what we fabricate. But of course, how much liquid you put down determines the volume you've got in that initial shape. Now, when you de-wet from being a film, that means you'll end up with an intermediate torus
Yes.
with a certain volume and a certain angle. And so that's sort of the volume in those experiments is controlling an intermediate state where you're de-wetting, but that's then becoming the priming state for the instability. Now, when you come out of that instability, what's happening also is we can change the voltage to ask the question, what's your final wetting state of your surface?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we can program it to be 30 degrees or 40 degrees or 50 degrees. And so we've certainly got systematic stuff that says if you change the volume in a certain direction, then you'll favor the lower order modes. If you increase the wettability, you'll favor the following modes. I'd have to get the slide to remind myself.
Yeah.
Elfigo and Rodrigo have worked on a theory behind that, and they've done an analytical theory on that. And so it's both the slip length, the mobility on the surface that you're controlling, and it's also the static wetting that you're controlling.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you.
I can see a hand up from Yutaka.
Yutaka, do you have a question? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, we know it's very late for you in Japan, so take your time.
Yeah, it is a bit fine. I'm very happy that I could catch up with the seminar, and thank you for a thorough review of your important work. And I'm curious about the lubricant surfaces. So when I want to know what happens when the drop slides over the lubricant impregnated surfaces. So is it actually the drop sliding on the oil layer, or oil is moving so that drop is carried with the oil?
So the oil can be depleted, but that's not really what's happening in terms of lubricating the motion. So when you have a very thin one, it's perfectly possible these surfaces over time will have a depletion of lubricant, but it's not the depletion of lubricant that's giving the motion. It is about changing that boundary condition, the shear stress between the two, and it's the ratio of viscosity to that. The interesting question that people who do fluid mechanics more than I are looking at, of course, is whether it's a rolling or sliding motion. And there's still some, I think, well, I need to review the most recent literature about the views between rolling and sliding in here,
right,
as a whole, but on that. Okay.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah,
yes, from my point of view.
Is it possible to lift the drop from the surface? Because it seems slippery, but it could be kind of sticky in a sense that it doesn't detach from the surface completely.
And indeed, one of my papers this year is called Slippery but Sticky.
Right. Right.
So I've got a paper with exactly a title like that. You're absolutely right, but in order to move a droplet along the surface as a droplet, you have essentially a front edge of the droplet and a back edge. And what you need to do is be able to essentially alter the necessary difference between the front edge angle and the back edge angle to become very small to create easy motion. So the force you need is determined by what we call the advancing and receding angles. Okay, and if you can make those angles very small, you can very easily move a droplet on a surface. And it doesn't matter whether there's a very big footprint on the surface, you can do that. And that's what controls whether you move along the surface. But if you try to pull a droplet off the surface, as you're pulling, the droplet sort of pulls itself inwards along the surface. And so you're dealing with what's called a receding angle. Now, in order to do that, you keep doing that. You're doing work to pull the droplet off the surface against that receding angle. And as a consequence, the receding angle controls the normal adhesion. Okay. And so you can have a very sticky surface for normal adhesion. You will not be able to pull things off at all easily. You'll try to retract it, and eventually you may have a neck that will break to allow the droplet comes off, or it may come off completely. But essentially that can be a very strong adhesive force while still having very mobile motion within the plane. And that's absolutely the case. A number of us are looking at that. I think Cleel's probably looking at that in his work as well. There's a number of us looking at that.
Yeah. Right. Thank you very much.
Any further questions? I have one question, Glenn. Just following on what Yutako has said, and the reason I'm asking because we have a PhD student, Young Hao, who's Hongyu, who's around with us, using these slip surfaces, and obviously you can make the layer of oil probably thicker and thicker. But when you try to understand what is the wetting of those drops, and you mentioned from Young equation and you developed a little bit an improvement to that. But obviously, if we go to much thicker oil layer, we will get in the Neumann law.
Yeah.
Instead of Young law. So my question, what is the best way to describe the wetting of those drops?
So the equation I gave what I called a liquid form of Young's law, or a lubricant form of Young's law, is the limiting contact angle for an infinitely thin lubricant. Okay, and you can work that out. So if you go to a thicker lubricant, you'll always end up with a smaller contact angle at the edge. What you'll also observe is you'll see this this skirt of lubricant oil being drawn up. But you're putting on, you know, a thicker oil, and because you're putting on a thicker oil, it will deplete. You will also get, of course, pressure, some sinking into it. And it will behave much more like a liquid lens on an oil bath. So, you know, there are rules around that, but you're in the transition zone as you go from one to the other. I mean, the other sorts of things that start to happen then is that as you get motion, of course, you essentially create an oil ridge at the front on the motion, and you get something like that. So where your dissipation is occurring, what's dominating the laws of motion changes, because it's a different type of process that's governing that.
Okay.
Don't know whether that answered your question, Khalil.
No, that's okay. Thank you very much. I think we are right on time. We have even 2 minutes left to spare. Those of us who have meetings at 3 o'clock, I think it's just about time to end this seminar. Thank you all for attending this, and thanks to Glenn. I think some people have found how to clap, actually. Right, okay, thanks very much, Glenn, and thanks everybody.
Thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.